This lesson plan template is not a real lesson plan, we realize. However, it does serve a purpose in providing a scaffold for new teachers to develop a lesson that adheres to constructivist learning theory and also requires teachers to think purposefully about aligning the purpose or context of the lesson, the learning objectives with the lesson activities, and then ensuring the objectives are assessed and proper supports are provided for all students to have an opportunity to learn. This template requires you to write out all of these things that we know you won't write out when doing daily lesson plans, but we hope you'll always be thinking about when developing and choosing lessons to teach. Good teachers do this intuitively. Great teachers do it purposefully. The first section is the information about the lesson. Some of this might be easier to come back and complete after planning out the activities of the lesson more. To use the template, the instructions for each section are in the gray box. The italicized bullet points provide direction for each aspect of the section. Leave all instructions in place and add new information below the dotted line. In MS Word, the box will expand as you type. The central focus and context rationale serves two purposes. First, to describe the main purpose of the lesson, simply what is it about. The context rationale is very important for what comes later in the lesson, when thinking about the activities students will do and the way in which you'll assess their learning. To do this properly should take a couple of paragraphs to explain not just what the content of the lesson is, but also why it is being taught. So how does it connect to the rest of the curriculum or the unit? What will make it have meaningful context? This piece also needs to explain the method of teaching. So you need to describe how you are teaching the lesson. And then lastly, and this sort of is teaching to the test of the EdTPA, I'll admit, you need to be able to align your methods of teaching to learning theory. We teach you constructivist learning theory, so that's most likely what you'll align it to in some way. And you'll have to do more than name drop. You must describe how in the lesson you might do such things as access prior knowledge and experience, provide for inquiry and lived experiences, and facilitate meaningful reflection. So the central focus and context rationale is written as a narrative. You are doing this for yourself and setting up a coherent lesson, but also for evaluators such as your professors or reviewers of your EdTPA, where you'll do something very similar. So think of this a bit like a test for you to show that you understand and can apply learning theory. And frankly, if you can't, you shouldn't be a teacher. This section might require coming back to and finishing up or editing after you finish the rest of the lesson plan. Next is the learning objectives. The key to these is that they are measurable and observable. The verb you use here is important, and you want the focus to be on what students will know and understand, and not just list a task. So sometimes the point of the lesson is to learn a skill, which will sound like a task. But even for that, you want to choose your verb carefully. Avoid such verbs as understand, or know, or complete. So here's an example. Students will understand the phases of the moon. When it comes time to think about assessment for this lesson, I don't have any idea what I'm really looking for. Will they name them? Describe them? I need to be more specific. Students will identify the phases of the moon. Students will describe the causes of phases of the moon. See how these verbs are much more measurable and observable. I can see if students can do these things by the end of the lesson. Here's another example. Students will complete a 5-paragraph essay. So by this objective, simply writing 5 paragraphs is success. My guess is that's not really all we'd be looking for. So instead, students will properly use punctuation. Students will write a paragraph with a topic sentence, and so on. Again, better verbs. This section is definitely not narrative. These are written for you to use and reference back to throughout the rest of the planning process. Objectives are very important in planning, but I don't share them with students. Instead, I like to use guiding questions. I prefer to use one guiding question to frame the lesson. If using guiding questions in unit planning, then every lesson should align to a guiding question from your unit plan. I like a single question that I could use somewhere in the beginning of the lesson to pique interest and access prior knowledge, and provide meaningful context, and then come back to at the end of the lesson and ask it again, when they can hopefully pull the pieces together and answer this time using proper terms and concepts correctly. The rest of this section is a combination of some nuts and bolts logistics, but also some crucial thinking that, if done deeply here, makes the next sections much easier. Materials need to be just that, but be sure to list this as if writing for a sub, and in addition to listing everything needed here, also provide links here, or where appropriate in the lesson details, to documents, videos, and so on, and include documents used with the lesson when you submit it, such as worksheets or PowerPoints. Imagine if you were a sub and you couldn't easily find those things, how frustrated you'd be. The misconceptions section is quite important to take a little time and think pretty deeply about. If you've never taught a topic before, this is admittedly difficult to do, but the more you teach something, the more you know what misconceptions a student might have coming into a lesson, and so you can be sure to plan on that ahead of time in your lesson. For example, I know that when I teach moon phases, many individuals believe the moon phases are caused by the Earth's shadow on the moon. It's not. That's an eclipse. Because I know this, I purposefully start lessons on this topic with questions and experience to force students to uncover this misconception, and then at the end of the lesson come back to that to ensure that they are reflecting on that misconception and using the activity I had them do to purposefully correct that misconception. If I don't, even if they did the lab activity right, many will falsely remember that misconception if it wasn't purposefully corrected. This is also helpful when thinking about what support students will need to be successful. We'll come back to this in differentiation. Like the misconception section, this is important for differentiation. And the more you teach a lesson, the easier this is to do. It's important to recognize what prior content you expect students to know. This is of course important and tied directly to misconceptions, but also gives you the starting point to go from. It also helps you identify where you might need to provide some supports for students who are deficient in the background foundational knowledge you expect them to already have. The prerequisite skills isn't just about content knowledge and skills, but also most often then language skills. If you're having them write an essay about a specific historical event, then you are assuming that they can write an essay effectively. So this section is something you'll come back to again when you do differentiation. What will you provide for students who are deficient in these expected foundational skills and knowledge so they can be successful? They deserve to be successful too. Lastly are the content standards. Not all lessons, of course, have to meet a standard, as standards provide the minimum of what we teach, not the maximum. But if there are standards met, and most likely there are, then list those out and not just the numbers identifying them. Okay, now we get to the most authentic part of the lesson, and the component that I hope you'll continue to do in some format once you are writing real lesson plans. You couldn't see it, but I put air quotes around real. The first section of the lesson plan details is the lesson introduction. This is more than just telling students what they are going to do today. I guess that's a fine strategy if the culture of your classroom is they learn because you tell them to do so. But really, we can do better than to just rely on extrinsic motivators and lessons that then might only result in short-term learning. We're about building enduring understandings. So I call this portion the consider portion of the lesson. It's not about telling them what they have to do. It's about inviting them into an inquiry. That's why I prefer using guiding questions to frame the lesson instead of "you will learn" objective statements. In a constructivist classroom, these are crucial because this is what learning theory tells us about how the human brain learns. What we learn is attached to prior experiences and knowledge, so we need to pique their interest to provide opportunity for an emotional connection to want to learn it and make meaning of it. It has to matter. Then we have to acknowledge that what they learn or experience, the human brain will file away by connecting it to a previous emotion or experience. So when we are accessing prior knowledge, we aren't just asking them what they know about something. Most often kids will say, "I don't know," even when they do. Instead, you are providing them a thinking prompt, a question, an observation, and so on that will connect any prior experiences they've had that relate to the topic at hand. For example, I could tell them we're going to learn about writing with proper punctuation, or I could show them an example of incorrect uses of commas that radically change the meaning of a sentence. This section is written for you and a sub, so it is a step-by-step set of instructions. No narrative needed, explaining reasoning, like in the central focus and context and rationale section. So it is written as bullet point, easy to find your place in statements. Imagine using this standing in front of a group of students. You want to be able to easily find your place in the next step. Or better, imagine a sub having to do so. Write it for that purpose. So for each bullet point step, then also estimate time needed for each step. Your steps need to include all the information you need to deliver the lesson. So references to handouts, key phrases, things you use in transition, key questions, things you might use in a discussion, how you want to group students, etc. Assume you'll forget to do it if you don't write it down. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten to the end of a lesson and realized I didn't say or ask something I thought I'd never forget. You will, especially if you are teaching a lesson multiple times. "Didn't I say that already?" is something you'll think to yourself after the 5th time teaching it. The lesson activities section is the meat of the lesson plan. In fact, when most teachers think of a lesson plan, or if you find a lesson plan in another resource, it is often just this section, the activity. But an activity does not a lesson plan make. The activity is the heart of the lesson plan, though. I call this section the construct portion of the lesson plan. This is when we provide students a new lived experience to build on their prior knowledge or experiences and make meaning or construct meaning. This requires active engagement. Enough with PowerPoint lectures requiring only passive participation, sort of like this video. Okay, those do have a place, but hopefully in conjunction with some engaging, active learning. Active doesn't always mean kinesthetic. We want students to do inquiry into something, not just be told about it. I could lecture to students about the importance of using metaphor in fiction writing, or I could provide them with some fiction to dissect. Remember, I'm an old biology teacher. And let them pull examples of metaphors from the fiction you are having them read, much like a scientist collects data. Constructivism is all about inquiry. Inquiry is really just a softer way of saying science. It's about asking questions, making observations, collecting evidence or data, and drawing conclusions from that. That's the scientific method invented by the human brain because that's how the human brain works. That's what students need to do to make meaning about a topic, explore it, and learn it. Learn about things that are relevant to them. And lastly, what you do needs to work for a variety of learners. The lesson conclusion isn't just about finishing the lesson when you run out of time and they turn in the assignment. I call this the confirm section because this is when learners confirm their learning and finish making meaning, and take that lived experience and connect it back to their prior experience and correct any misconceptions. If they don't, it is often just rented information. This doesn't have to be a lengthy chunk of the lesson, but these things are absolutely crucial for true learning to occur. They must have an opportunity to share what they have learned, compare it to what they thought at the beginning, and correct any misconceptions. Or maybe even compare what they did or observed with what an expert about the subject might say. So often a true inquiry-based lesson will save the teacher lecturing for here after the students have worked with the content in an authentic manner. And of course, you and the students are checking for understanding. Confirming might often continue to happen the next day. This is common if you have students turn in an assignment. What happens next with that assignment is where the final ownership of knowledge happens, as they extend their learning based on the feedback or feed forward that you give them. How will they use this assignment to not just feel good or bad about getting something right or wrong, but how will they use this to continue to learn? How will your feedback facilitate that, not just score and sort them? Now we get back to the inauthentic part of the lesson plan and return to writing as a narrative, sort of like the first section. We are asking you to do this, knowing you won't do this with real lesson plans, but doing this now to train your brain to think about these things and also as a bit of a test of your application of learning theory. And yes, practice for this very kind of writing you'll have to do on the EdTPA. But regardless, this is what good teachers incorporate into their lessons. Great teachers do it purposefully. Language demand is the language and language skills that will be demanded of the students to complete the lesson. So the easy part is the vocabulary. Simply list the content and non-content vocabulary. This might include language you use in school that isn't part of the content. For example, if you are using a rubric and tell students to use the rubric as a guide for what to write in the essay you are assigning, that doesn't do any good if they don't know what the word rubric means. And let's be honest, outside of school, who uses that word? The harder part of the language demand is the syntax and discourse. These are the language skills that they will be required to use to complete the lesson. Taking notes, reading instructions, and so on are syntax, anything working with written language. Listening to instructions, explaining procedures, participating in a discussion are all discourse language demands. It's important to identify these things in your lesson design. You need to think deeply about all these language skills being demanded and describe those in detail here. Doing so here will greatly ease your planning for supporting these students when you think about differentiation next. That brings us to language function. This is about how students will then use the language demand to complete the executive functioning to properly make sense of what they are learning. So this connects directly back to the verbs in the learning objective. Will they recall information? Will they describe something, compare and contrast, analyze the use of metaphor and fiction, for example? So we are asking you to elaborate on how they will complete this executive functioning, thinking, processing of information in the lesson and where that will occur. If students have roadblocks to the learning, it doesn't matter how great of an activity you've got planned. They won't learn it. Like the previous section, this is a narrative, an analysis of the lesson activities. Everything you describe in this section should be describing something that happened in the lesson plan details section. This first section, building on personal, community, cultural assets, might seem an odd thing for differentiation. But what this is really about is making the lesson meaningful and relevant. Otherwise, the only reason to do it is because you told them to do it for the grade. As much as we can, we want to tap into intrinsic motivation and not rely on extrinsic motivators. So think deeply about how this lesson is authentic. And authentic doesn't have to mean it is some grand project that will change the world. Authentic means that it has meaningful context. You could be working towards having students creating an authentic project that addresses an environmental issue in their town. But as a part of that bigger project, they might need to complete a lesson on how to write a letter to their senator. So writing lessons without any context are busy work and boring, most likely in the eyes of the student. Lessons about writing letters for the purpose of learning the skill to write to their senator about something they care about is now authentic, even if that lesson for the day otherwise might seem kind of routine and boring out of context. So what is the context that will make this important to them? You have to have a reason to group the students. It could be random. That's okay if that supports the purpose of the lesson and the learning theory you referenced in the context and rationale. I told you we'd come back to that. Describe the groups you're using and why and how that supports their learning, or explain why they need to work individually, though I suspect they won't work alone for the entire lesson. This is about how you are supporting all learners to be successful. So you have to anticipate where they will struggle and plan to support that. I always start by thinking about students that will be in all classes, in addition to the students with the very specific disabilities identified with an IEP. Always plan on students who will struggle with reading, writing, and maintaining focus, identified or not. So you can see the connection back here to the academic language. And then realize that planned supports don't always have to be something grand or only provided to a student you've identified with an IEP. For example, if having students write an essay response to a question, I might provide a word bank of vocabulary words for that topic. I can provide it to all, but I'd be planning that 5 students I know struggle with recalling the vocabulary or suffer some form of test anxiety are the ones who need it and why I'm actually providing it. That's a targeted planned support, but it's not like I walked up to that student and handed it just to them. Or I build into the activity brain break activities, knowing that not all need it, but thinking of those that do, they will benefit, and those that don't really need it, well, they'll probably still benefit from it. The point is that you might already be doing many planned supports, and in this section you really need to dig into those. The more supports you provide, the better. Those that don't need them won't use them, but those that do will have them at their ready when they do. And the more planned supports are ubiquitous throughout the routines of your classroom, the more students are learning how to use them when they need them. So they are learning how they learn and how to advocate for their own needs and learning, thus becoming lifelong learners. Now we come to the last narrative section of the Enhanced Lesson Plan. This section is crucial for 2 reasons. This analysis of the assessment throughout the lesson pulls everything together in requiring you to connect the dots between the purpose of the lesson and learning objectives, the activities students participate in, and how you know they were successful with those objectives, and finally, how you use these experiences to further continued learning beyond this lesson. Plus, being able to connect these dots is necessary to be successful on the EdTPA, but even more important, to being a great teacher. Key to this success is recognizing that everything that happens in the lesson is actually assessment. From the informal observations you make of students as you introduce the lesson to any formal graded work submitted by the students at the end of the lesson. The error so many teachers make is to focus on that formal assignment only, thinking that is the only assessment. Every observation and interaction is assessment. Plus, students are constantly engaging in self-assessment. So you need to purposefully think about how you are using that assessment to further learning. Of any of the narrative instructions, these are the closest to being a list of questions to answer. Though I still recommend not simply answering these, but instead writing out a narrative and then using these as a self-check to ensure that you have included the correct information. But in that narrative, be very explicit with clearly stating learning objectives and how and where they are met in the lesson, citing specific examples of what students do, how they do it, and also then what evidence you are looking for. And this doesn't mean just stating that you will make observations while they participate in a discussion, for example, but clearly identifying what will be the things you are listening for in that discussion. What key phrases and terms will you be expecting to hear so you know they are meeting the learning objective? On a submitted assignment, what concepts are you looking to see and read in their writing? That's what we mean by what evidence are you looking for. And then lastly, what will happen with the feedback that you give them to continue their learning? So how will they get that feedback, and how will you facilitate them to use that feedback as feed forward? Lastly, I want you to recognize that this lesson plan writing and the exercise of the enhanced lesson plan is an iterative process, and not necessarily one you will complete in the sequence as each step appears on the template. Some kind of 3D hologram like Tony Stark uses in The Avengers would be a better way to complete this exercise, recognizing the interweaving of each step. But alas, we're stuck in the real world. When you complete an enhanced lesson plan, it is natural to start with the information about the lesson and then to proceed to the lesson activities and do those sequentially as well. And then do the academic language, followed by the differentiation, and concluding with the assessment. And you probably will do it in that sequence when completing the template, but consider that you most likely will start here in your thinking before you write anything down, but thinking of or starting by searching for the right activity you want to do. So it's okay to write that section first if that works for you, or at least recognize that if you fill the template out sequentially, you might need to loop back to the central focus and context and rationale to adequately write about the learning theory used. That as you fully analyze the academic language, this may cause you to revise the verbs used in your learning objectives, which might then impact what you write for the assessment section. As you analyze the assessment, you might need then to go back and add to the lesson conclusion. I could keep going, but you get the point. The middle part is the lesson plan and the authentic action we want you to continue doing as a teacher in some format, using a template of your own design eventually. And the rest of it is the analytical thinking you should always be thinking about as a teacher, and in this exercise and template, complete around and about the activity of the actual lesson you teach.